Bună ziua și bine ați venit. Mulțumesc pentru că ați răspuns invitației noastre. Aș vrea să spun câteva cuvinte despre doamna Sandra Steingraber. Dr. Sandra Steingraber, om de știință recunoscut, autoarea unor cărți scrise pe limba publicului larg, pe această temă, deținătoarea mai multor premii pentru activitatea sa în domeniul protecției mediului, a ținut conferințe la universitățile Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Columbia, iar actual este profesor la Colegiul din Ithaca, din Statul New York. Și, nu în ultimul rând, mama. Dau cuvântul doamnei Sandra Steingraber.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to be here in this most beautiful building to talk with you in a politically neutral space about the scientific evidence for the environmental and health harms of fracking. I come with data and evidence to share from the United States. I am a member of an organization called Concerned Health Professionals of New York, and all of us are physicians or scientists who work on public health. And all together we have spent 2 years studying the science on the health effects of fracking, and this is the data that I am going to share with you today. My main message to you about fracking for shale gas is that there is no evidence to say that it is safe for women and children who live nearby, and much evidence to say that it is dangerous. So much evidence that we have called in the United States for a moratorium on fracking until the health studies can be done. There are no comprehensive health studies that have been done yet, but we have emerging science showing harm, and that is the science that I want to describe for you. And in so doing, I realize that the message I bring to you today is very different from the U.S. elected officials that came to talk to you about fracking yesterday, including Senator John McCain. But I'm going to be speaking on the science rather than on the politics of fracking. So I'll begin by taking you down into the shale itself. So the bedrock that underlies Romania, as well as the bedrock that underlies New York, where I live, is made of shale. And this shale represents an ancient ocean floor from 400 million years ago. The bubbles of methane that are trapped inside of this rock represent the bodies of the animals who lived in this ancient ocean. And this ancient ocean was part of Earth when there was not as much oxygen as there is today. And so when these creatures died and sank to the bottom of the sea, they turned into bubbles of methane, which is what natural gas is. 1 carbon plus 4 hydrogens. And then silt fell down on top of these bubbles and trapped them there. And then over time it became rock. And so a mile below the surface of Romania is an ancient ocean floor containing bubbles of methane, also in New York and other places in the United States. In order to get these bubbles out, the bedrock has to be shattered, it has to be blown apart, and that is what fracking is. The club that is used to shatter the shale is, of course, water, but water all by itself does not result in fracking because the weight of the earth would press all of the bits of shale back together again once the pressure is released. So grains of sand are added to the water, and those sand grains are blasted into the cracks where they prop open the doors in the shale so that the gas can flow out. So now we can see the first 2 threats that fracking creates because of the water and because of the sand. So fracking makes water disappear from the hydrologic cycle. Humans have never done anything like this before, but with fracking, we take water from the surface of the earth and bury it a mile below the water table, so it will never again return to us as rain or snow. It will never be a lake or a stream. It will never be groundwater currently used for fracking is also a threat because it is a special kind of sand called silica sand, which is very strong, and the grains of sand will not crumble when the weight of the earth presses down on it. But silica sand also causes lung cancer and a disease called silicosis. And so in the fracking sites, we see high levels of silica dust in the air, which form a threat to workers who are on the site. So much so that our federal agency that represents the health of workers has spoken out about the threat by breathing in the silica dust. And in addition, women and children and families who live nearby are being exposed to high levels of a known carcinogen, silica dust. In addition to the water and the sand, many chemicals are added to the fracking fluid for many reasons. One of them is to reduce friction. Another is because the shale itself is a living ecosystem with small organisms that live underneath the ground in the shale, and those small organisms will fill up the pipes and interfere with the flow of gas. And so powerful poisons are added to fracking fluid to kill off these organisms that live at such deep inside the earth. And so these very poisonous chemicals, some of them cause cancer, some of them interfere with our hormones. They are also being injected deep into the earth, and on their journey down, they must pass through our drinking water aquifers. And of course, when they are carried to the fracking fields, they often spill, or there can be accidents. We also worry very much about the cement well casings, which are the sleeve that goes around the drill hole from the surface down to the earth. Then it turns sideways and extends horizontally through the shale. So this cement well casing now is the only barrier between all the poisons that have been injected and the atmosphere and the water that lies above. But we know that cement, while it is very strong, is not immortal, and it can crack and shrink and crumble with time and open up pathways for potential contamination from deep under the earth up to the water and also into our atmosphere. The chemicals contained in the shale are not just methane. Methane is what we want when we drill for natural gas. But all of those ancient creatures turned into other chemicals too. Some of them are benzene, some of them are propane, butane, ethane, and so on. And so these chemicals are also liberated with the gas. And if the cement well casing is cracked or otherwise impaired, then these chemicals also have a pathway to our water and to our air. So now I will describe for you some of the actual studies that have been published, and then I will close my talk by showing you a small film clip so that you can actually see pictures of what fracking operations look like in the United States. Last week, concerned health professionals of New York submitted a letter to Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, together with 250 health organizations and individual physicians, nurses, midwives, scientists, and other health professionals who signed the letter. And this letter calls for a 3 to 5 year moratorium on fracking in New York, both because of the science that's already done, which shows signs for harm, but also because of unanswered questions for which we have no science. And we argue ethically we can't move forward with fracking until we have answers to these very important health questions. I know that my hosts are intending to translate this letter into Romanian so that we can share it with all of you. Now I will tell you about some of the major trends in the data that we've summarized for our own governor. First, even though the gas industry continues to deny that water contamination is linked to fracking, we now have evidence that is indisputable to say that in fact water has by drilling and fracking operations. Investigations have confirmed water contamination in 4 states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Texas. These contaminants include methane, which is natural gas, radioactive radium, the carcinogen arsenic, and multiple hormone-disrupting substances. These are the so-called endocrine disruptors. This last discovery is especially worrisome to us because endocrine disruptors can exert powerful effects on human development and pregnancy at very, very low concentrations. There is no safe level of exposure to endocrine disruptors. A new review by the Council of Canadian Academies now agrees with us. In their report, they conclude that the most important questions about groundwater contamination from shale gas development are not whether groundwater impacts have or will occur, but where or when they will occur. According to the best available data to us in the United States, 5 to 7% of gas wells leak immediately and more than half leak after 30 years. So these findings lead to the question about whether regulations could fix all these problems. I think the answer is no, although we still need to study this very closely, but we have no evidence to suggest now that regulations can work. And the reason is that drilling and fracking itself appears to contribute to loss of well integrity. Drilling creates fractures in the surrounding rock, and the cement does not completely fill these fractures. And so pathways are opened for the upward migration of liquids and gases. And then, as I said earlier, as cement ages, it shrinks and pulls away from the surrounding rock, and the tightness of the seal is reduced. And again, we open pathways of potential contamination. No regulations, no best practices can prevent this problem as far as we know now. I want to now talk about the risk of earthquakes, which is very real with fracking. And earthquakes can be created by drilling and fracking opportunities in 2 ways. One is by the process of fracking itself, and the other way, which is perhaps more important, occurs when the waste products from fracking are buried once again in the ground, because these are very poisonous chemicals, and then we inject them back into the ground because we have no other place to put them. Remember that I said in order to reduce friction, slippery chemicals need to be added to fracking fluid because the hole by which the drill goes down is very small, and to exert high pressure on shale so far below the surface of the earth, there's a lot of friction to go down the hole. And so the chemicals that reduce the friction and are very slippery also lubricate the underground rocks, making them easier to slide against each other. And so both the process of fracking, which itself is a minor earthquake, but the lubricating the underground rocks with all of these slippery chemicals during the fracking process, or when waste is re-injected into the earth, our geologists now say raises the risk for earthquakes. And I understand Romania has a history with earthquake, and so this is something that should be taken very seriously. So I will let you read for yourself the studies on earthquakes. They come from the United Kingdom, Canada, Mexico, and Ohio. And our U.S. geologists have said that geologists do not yet know how to predict the timing or location of fracking-induced earthquakes, but they do know that they can occur tens of miles away from the wells themselves. The last trend in the data I want to mention is air pollution. And we know that air quality impacts from fracking-related activities are very clear now. There is air pollution wherever fracking goes, and that air pollution arises from the fracking process itself, but also from the intensive transportation demands. There are many thousands of trucks that are required. There are diesel engines to exert all that pressure for fracking. And then there are condenser stations, so that when the gas comes up out of the ground, it goes into a kind of distillery to separate out fracked communities, the smog level, the ground level ozone rises after fracking comes into an area. We also know a lot about the health effects of breathing ozone or smog. They include premature death, asthma in children, stroke and heart attack in adults, and in infants, low birth weight and premature birth. These are very, very costly and expensive problems. As for actual health studies done on the people who live in fracked communities, I will mention just one group, but would be happy to answer your questions about all of the different studies. Some of them are still ongoing, and we will get answers in about 3 to 5 years. But some of the best data we have been conducted on pregnant women and infants. Pregnancy is only 9 months long, and so when people are exposed to air and water contamination, sometimes health effects like cancer might not show up for years later, but with a pregnancy, a baby is born only 9 months later. And so researchers have looked at birth defects, at the weight of the baby at birth, and also measured its responsiveness. And in all of those measures in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Colorado, we see problems with babies born to mothers whose pregnancies were lived near drilling and fracking operations. In Colorado, we see high rates of birth defects, and in Utah, we see high rates of stillbirth or infant death, and in Pennsylvania, we see small babies, lower birth weight in babies. We also have a lot of good data on the economics of fracking, and the economic picture also has health consequences. In the name of time, I won't describe those studies here, but will simply mention that the size of the gas reserves are very often much less than the gas companies predicted. We've seen that phenomenon in the Marcellus Shale where I live, where the U.S. Geological Survey cut the estimate of how much natural gas is in the bedrock from 400 trillion cubic feet down to only 84. So that would provide the United States only 3 years of gas. In California, the amount of gas in the shale has been cut by 96%. Now, the reason there are health consequences from these economic facts is that in order for these companies to make a profit, they have to drill as fast as they can and spread drilling out very, very quickly. This requires migrant laborers. And so the workers coming into our community are not living with their families. And so we see then an increase in social problems, rape of women, drunk driving, guns, drugs, and so on. Also, the fatality rate from traffic accidents in fracked communities goes up usually by a factor of 4. And it's not only the workers who are getting killed, but also the families living in the areas. So you've listened to me for a long time now. I'm eager to listen to you, so I'm happy to hear your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a wonderful presentation, and thank you very much for your information that you talk about. But please tell us what you think about CO2 and methane emissions of fracking. Because as I know, these emissions of exploitation of shale gas are bigger than in the case of exploitation of standard gas, let's say. And they are very important in a negative way regarding climate changes, because this is another issue which I think that is very important. Thank you.
In fact, this was the topic of my address at the Green Week at the European Union Commission last week to talk about climate change and fracking. And indeed, there are CO2, which is the one we hear a lot about. And when natural gas is burned, it creates half of the amount of CO2 as coal does. And so it has been called the clean fossil fuel for that reason. However, the invisible brother of CO2 is methane, and when methane is not burned, but rather is released as an invisible vapor, it's far more powerful at trapping heat than CO2. So for a short time frame, CO2 is not as important as methane, and we cannot solve the problem of climate change without controlling methane. Many of us believe that we only have a short time frame left in which to solve the problem, and therefore we cannot frack our way into climate stability. In other words, fracking does not help the story of climate change. At best, it moves us sideways. Depending on how the science turns out, it may actually move us backwards.
Academia de Studii Economice. Întrebarea mea, sunt foarte dezamăgită de, expunerea a fost foarte bună, dar sunt foarte dezamăgită de situație. Întrebarea ar fi, în Statele Unite a existat o dezbatere înainte de a se da drumul la fracturarea hidraulică sau nu? Adică oamenii de știință și-au pus problema acestor pericole, pentru că pe mine, din punct de vedere științific, ai obligația într-un laborator, într-un loc fix să studiezi, nu să dai drumul la o exploatare și nu paralel să dai drumul, ca să zic așa, la cercetări dacă face rău sau nu exploatarea. Mi se pare, spus, sunt foarte dezamăgită, dacă într-o țară ca Statele Unite, care ne așteptăm să fie democrată, să țină cont de populația ei, nu se întâmplă aceleași lucruri, atunci ce ne putem aștepta la o țară mai mică? Adică avem un exemplu rău, adică așa o să facă și ai noștri, o să dea drumul la exploatare, ceea ce am și început, și în paralel o să cerceteze dacă face rău sau nu. Și până cercetează, își termină exploatarea. Deci întrebarea ar fi, de ce nu s-a luat sau dacă s-a luat, dacă s-a discutat înainte de a se da drumul la dumneavoastră în Statele Unite?
Fracking can't be tested in the laboratory, and we have no other planet to try it out on. And so it has been tested in people's own backyards, which is, we argue in New York, is wrong, because people should not be turned into unconsenting subjects in a vast human experiment without their informed consent. That said, there are particular historical reasons that in the U.S. that have led us to our unfortunate situation, and they have to do with decisions that were made in 2005 in a law that was passed called the Energy Policy Act. And this law exempted hydraulic fracturing from key provisions of all of our federal environmental laws. This was, the architect of this plan was our vice president at the time, Dick Cheney, who had been previously the chairman of the Halliburton Company, which is one of the pioneers and inventors of fracking. And so, in other words, fracking does not have to follow the laws that all other industries must follow. And this has made science very hard for us to do as scientists, because all other industries, if they're using inherently toxic chemicals, must report all the releases to air and water. And so if there are releases and scientists are concerned that people might be being exposed, they can go test the air, the water, people's blood for the presence of these chemicals. But the gas companies don't have to tell us what chemicals they're using or releasing. They're not measuring what comes out of these wells. And so we then, when people become sick, they have nosebleeds, they have sores, the pregnancies don't work out. We don't know. We can't make the connection between the chemical and the illness. So democracy itself is fractured with fracking, I think, and that's been the lesson in the United States, and we're all shocked about that. Even in my state of New York, where we've stopped fracking so far, we are receiving many of the waste products, and the actual gas itself is being stored in New York. And so people are resisting that. So last night in my small village in upstate New York, many people were protesting because the federal government has given permission to store all this methane gas in abandoned salt mines underneath our lake, our beautiful Seneca Lake, which is the source of drinking water for 100,000 people. And we have evidence to suggest those salt caverns, they sit on a geological fault line, so and there was just an earthquake there a few months ago. So we feel that if it should leak, then all this beautiful water would be ruined. And also, it's the center of our wine growing region, which is a $4 billion economy for us. This lake, Seneca Lake, is so deep and contains so much water that we have a Mediterranean climate very far north in New York, allowing wine grapes to grow on the shoreline. But the gas industry has bought a big swath of the shoreline, not because it wants the grapevines on the surface, but to store the gas in these old abandoned salt caverns from the 19th century. So last night there was a protest about this decision, and in the next county there was another protest because that community is receiving all the drill cuttings which are going into their landfill. So when you drill down a mile and then go a mile this way, what comes out of the ground is a lot of tons and tons of rock and clay, and some of this is radioactive. And so it's being dumped in our landfills. And so people, even though we're not fracking, we're receiving all this waste from Pennsylvania just 40 miles away. So my message, I guess, is that this is a huge industry that can only make a profit if it drills everywhere across the landscape. And when you do something that large, you get huge amounts of things that need to be stored, huge amounts of waste that need to be disposed of. And even if fracking doesn't happen in your community, you may have to live next to these massive industrial sites, whether you want to or not. And that's the part where we've learned that democracy and fracking really don't belong together.
Sunt două întrebări. Prima se adresează pregătirii dumneavoastră de doctor în biologie și medicină și a doua din punctul meu de vedere ca inginer. Prima întrebare. Sunt făcute studii epidemiologice care să reflecte pericolul fracturării hidraulice, ținând cont că acum mai puțin, aproximativ o lună, EPA, Departamentul de Protecție a Mediului din Statele Unite, a înaintat la Curtea Supremă de Justiție a Statelor Unite, a intentat un proces prin care vrea să iasă de sub amendamentul Halliburton, din cauza că peste 100 de milioane de oameni sunt afectați de poluarea apei, ținând cont și de accidentul din 9 ianuarie, când în West Virginia 300 de mii de oameni nu mai pot să folosească apa potabilă. Revin cu a doua întrebare.
So my PhD is from University of Michigan, and I'm trained as a community ecologist. And then after I finished there in 1989, moved into environmental health, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard, and then at University of Illinois in women's public health policy. And then have written 3 books on environmental health since that time. So the epidemiology is just beginning. So we mostly have case studies, not long-term epidemiological studies. But there are some now in Pennsylvania that are starting. So this makes it very difficult for us because we don't have the kind of evidence for harm that we would like to have, and yet we have no knowledge. And so we also can't say that it's safe. So, for example, there are some good studies that have come out that have looked at health effects of people in gas drilling areas and also looked at health problems in their livestock and in their companion animals such as dogs and cats. And oftentimes you see that all the people and the animals both have the same symptoms. In some cases, a lot of cattle died drinking water contaminated by fracking fluid, whereas the cattle on the other pasture that drank different water source did not die and did not have problems with pregnancies. So we have preliminary data, and for that reason, we in the public health community have said that we have emerging signs for harm that are concerning to us. We have no data saying that this process is safe. So therefore, in order to protect people's health, we should call for a moratorium on fracking until the science can be done. And we have also specified the kind of science we want to be done, which would be a comprehensive health impact assessment, which is a particular tool of inquiry developed by the World Health Organization and also endorsed by our own United States Centers for Disease Control, which would investigate the harms of fracking and also monetize those harms. And so if we see an increase, for example, in children with asthma in places where fracking has occurred, and we do see that in Texas, then we could say how much additional money that would cost to the community to have sick children and so forth. But those comprehensive studies have not yet been done. We're calling for those studies, but we're also saying that first you declare a moratorium and protect people first, and then you do the studies. That's our request in the U.S., and I think it's a good request for you here in Romania. Maybe easier because you haven't built fracking out in the United States. It has momentum now. It's very hard to stop.
Unfortunately, I have to leave in just a few minutes, so I have one more short question. I've been in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago, and I met some representatives from U.S. Department. And I met people from the environmental department, and they were very optimistic, and they showed that somehow they are in the front line against CO2 emissions, and there are some new policies started by Obama administration regarding reducing CO2 emissions. On the other hand, I met people from the energy department who are very supporting on shale gas. And I see that there is a kind of conflict between these two visions for the future. Do you think that there is a way to use the political tool of these new policies of Obama administration regarding environment in this battle against fracking?
I think that the specifics of the Obama plan that only focus on carbon dioxide sees out of one eye and is blind out of the other, because it says nothing about methane, and the science on methane is getting more and more clear. So many of us are critical of the Obama plan for creating disincentives for coal, which will also then increase incentives for natural gas as a consequence. On the other hand, in the United States, you might know that there are many people and many elected officials who simply deny the reality of climate change altogether. And so maybe the Obama plan is the president's glasnost moment, where he begins a conversation and now people start talking about climate change as though it were real. And then we can have an honest conversation about methane down the road. So I think the value in his statements and in his actions are not good on the face of it for fracking and for the work that I'm doing, but in a larger way, finally end the silence among people, among Republicans, who now need to actually look at the evidence. So there's an awakening in the United States for climate change, and on that grounds, it's a good thing. And then we hope now with this awakening, we can begin to use the science to show that it doesn't make sense that fracking should be part of the solution for climate change. And even here in Romania, I see things that don't add up, don't align impact on the climate would be very long and very ruinous. And of course, the children of Romania and everywhere else in Europe will be left with the poisoned water forever. And so energy security needs to be found through some other way than fracking. So it's the wrong solution. To give you a flavor of the pace of the science, there are now about 200 studies in the peer-reviewed scientific literature on the harms of fracking, both for health and for the environment. And in the first 4 months of 2014, there are more studies have been published than in all of 2011, 2012 combined. And so the pace of science is increasing. And so it was probably true in a few years ago to say, you have no evidence for your concerns, but now the data are starting to come out, and we know that scientists are in the laboratory now working on studies, and they'll have results in 3 to 5 years that will make the fracking look even more damning.
Dacă dovedile sunt evidente că fracturarea hidraulică afectează cel puțin comunitatea locală unde se desfășoară această activitate. Există în Statele Unite studii asupra faptului că există anumite locații, și în special în România, în partea de vest a României, unde se dorește fracturarea hidraulică și unde sunt mari producători agricoli. În sensul ăsta este afectată producția agricolă atât din punct de vedere cantitativ cât și calitativ, cât și circuitul, producția zootehnică și așa mai departe. Ori, având în vedere că producția agricolă și producția zootehnică din acea zonă nu deservește doar populația din zona respectivă, ci deservește un spectru foarte larg de populație, inclusiv populația din afara zonelor în care se face exploatarea nu acesta. În sensul ăsta există un studiu asupra sănătății populației prin consumarea acestor produse, atât cereale cât și animaliere, contaminate prin acest procedeu. Și dacă există, care ar fi rezultatele? Pentru că este foarte interesant de știut și ar trebui luate în seamă, inclusiv de România, în a da sau nu da drumul acestor exploatări.
I know that we have Farmers Against Fracking as a chapter of Yorkers Against Fracking because they fear these concerns. And we have also seen New York City markets refusing to buy food from places in Pennsylvania where fracking is being practiced for fear that there may be contamination. I haven't seen any data on food that has been tested in areas where fracking has been done. I don't think there's been funding available yet to do those studies, to my knowledge. One of the big part of our opposition in New York are chefs against fracking, who are a group of chefs in New York City who wish that their ingredients for their famous dishes will be protected against fracking. So they have been very vocal in speaking out against opening New York State to fracking. So I think the issue of farming and fracking is something that needs more attention in terms of food contamination. But where we have better data is understanding how much land is taken out of production by fracking. Because once you build the fracking site and all of the infrastructure it requires, many, many acres for every well, then that area is not farmable anymore. So, for example, again, you speak personally in my community. New York State was once known to grow a lot of wheat and was the breadbasket for all of the Northeast. And then when wheat moved out to our Great Plains states, such as Kansas and Nebraska, we stopped making bread. But now there is interest in local food and making bread again, and so we have brought back heirloom wheat that can grow where it's cold and wet. And so we're now growing wheat again, and in my village there is a mill to grind this wheat because it must be ground in a special way. It's low gluten wheat, And then there are recipes that have been discovered from the 19th, 18th centuries to make very delicious bread out of the wheat, and then we have a bakery now to make this bread. And it's so delicious and so popular that it sells for a very high price. And if you want this bread, you must sign a subscription list and stand in line once a week to get your bread from the bakery, because there's so much demand for it and not enough supply. So you might think, well, if everyone wants this bread, then why not plant more wheat and employ more people at the mill and employ more people at the bakery to make this bread? And the answer is because the wheat fields are surrounded by land leased to the gas industry, and so they cannot expand their production of wheat because all of this land is, perhaps if we lift our moratorium, will be fracked, and so it's a bad investment for a farmer to invest in this delicious bread. And so here we have our situation where we have put at risk our wine industry, our water, and our bread. Wine, water, and bread, basics for any civilization in order to pursue, I would say, a false dream of temporary profits for a fossil fuel that will bring temporary profit to a few people and permanent ruin to many. So the impact of fracking on agriculture is something that absolutely needs our further study, but simply from my observations from where I live, I think it's had a terrible effect already, and fracking hasn't even arrived where I live yet.
Sunt din Arad, reprezint o societate agricolă care exploatează circa 7500 de hectare de pământ și multe efective de animale. Întrebarea mea este, după ce dumneavoastră a susținut și ne-ați informat destul de clar ceea ce se întâmplă, vreau să am o întrebare simplă. De ce dumneavoastră, cu grupul dumneavoastră de studiu, nu ați făcut mai multe experimente comasate pe animale, exact în epicentru acolo a puțurilor, văzând pe efectele de la apa intoxicată, de la aerul intoxicat, de la pământul intoxicat. Cred că era mai oportun decât să așteptăm rezultatele asupra oamenilor care să ajungem doar cobai.
Well, thank you for your solidarity across the ocean. You might know that the European Union's Health and Environmental Alliance, which represents 65 NGOs across the EU, it has also this week called for a moratorium on shale gas fracking in Europe for reasons of unanswered health concerns. And your suggestion to study animals is a good one, and in fact has been done. The study carried out by a veterinarian and a biochemist has gone to several places to look at livestock and pets and published their research in a scientific journal. I'm happy to provide you the citation for that. In addition, they've taken the additional step of releasing their results in a book for all members of the public to read. So it's not simply written in the language of animal science, but written in a plain English. And this book will be released in the United States in August. So I myself have written a foreword to the book, so perhaps this is something to be translated into Romanian when it comes out. One last point I want to say about animals is that in New York we are a dairy state. We have, I think we are number 3 in all the states in terms of milk and yogurt and cheese production. And we're very concerned about milk because milk, more than any other biological media, is very vulnerable to chemical contamination. The lessons of Chernobyl showed us that. And because the fracking waste that comes out of the ground with the gas in my part of the world is very contaminated with many different things, including radium and radioactive substances. If this should be spilled on pasture land, then we're concerned that it will find its way into our milk. So any area that is a dairy state, it has particular worries, I would say, for contamination. And the question before all of us is whether we want to risk our food supply for temporary supply of gas. Lastly, again, to the points made by the U.S. senators who were pleading here yesterday, if they see fracking as a form of energy security for Romania, then they must be implying that it will be here for a long time. If it will be here for a long time, it's no longer a bridge to a renewable future, and it becomes a big problem for climate change. So both of those things cannot be true. You can't build fracking to serve as a short bridge for a renewable future, and also claim that you're providing the nation's energy security. Energy security provides, the word security implies a solution for the long haul, and the idea of a bridge implies something temporary. Both of those things cannot be true. So the narratives about fracking are clashing with each other.
În 2013, Guvernul României a dat un aviz negativ pe acest proiect de lege. Sunt 6 puncte de vedere ale Guvernului și vreau să vă spun, fac referire doar la punctul 3 de pe această scrisoare venită de la Guvern, care dă aviz negativ pe proiectul colegului meu, Tudor Ciubodan. Îi spun că există o nouă generație de tehnologii de fracturare din gama tehnologii curate. Și aș vrea să pun întrebarea aici, pentru că nu sunt expertă, nu sunt specialistă nici în sănătate, nici în mediu. Avem aici un expert, o avem pe doamna doctor Sandra Steingraber lângă noi, avem specialiști, avem reprezentanții Ministerului Mediului și care aș vrea să-i aud vorbi, pentru că noi nu ne pricepem nici senatorii și nici deputații. Deciziile pe care le luăm în Camera Deputaților ar trebui să aibă la bază niște cercetări, niște studii, cel puțin în domeniul acesta, cum de astăzi și în alte domenii. Deci, ei au spus că există tehnologii de fracturare din gama tehnologiilor curate și a tehnologiilor rapide, care vor fi în mod cert folosite la scară industrială în maxim 2 ani. Există așa ceva? Există așa ceva? Există astfel de tehnologii care să nu ducă către un impact negativ asupra sănătății umane?
Well, I agree, of course, that science should drive the decision, not the claims of the industry and their advertisements for themselves. And we also in the United States hear over and over again about green fracking and safe chemicals, but so far we have not seen any actual data on that process. Only claims that it's coming, but it never seems to arrive. And also keep in mind that there are inherent dangers that have nothing to do with the actual chemicals being used, but simply blowing apart the bedrock itself liberates not only the methane, but the many other chemicals contained in the shale itself. And I'm a biologist, I'm not a geologist, so I'm learning this for the first time. But the whole periodic chart of elements is contained in these deep geological formations, not only the radioactive substances that I've mentioned, but also heavy metals like lead, like mercury, and like arsenic. And so also ancient seawater that used to be part of that old ocean from 400 million years ago is also down into the ground, and that brine also comes up. So when we, in New York State, looked at the amount of waste that would be generated from the number of fracking wells that would go into our land, it turned out that the waste products would be equal to 35 hours of flow from the Niagara Falls. The Niagara Falls is a very famous waterfalls in New York, one of the world's largest. So if you can imagine standing in front of the Niagara Falls for 35 hours, that would be the amount of liquid waste that we would have to dispose of. So whether or not we use green fracking chemicals or not, that waste will have salt, will have radiation, will have arsenic and lead and children's lives depend on it. As a mother, it's my job to protect my children from harm and to plan for their future. And as long as we're threatened by fracking, I can't do my job as a mother. And so I'm determined to close the door on fracking. And I feel that we can win this. My friends who are economists say that the economics of shale gas make no long-term sense. One of them has said, shale gas is not a revolution, it's a retirement party for the fossil fuel industry. It's a sign of desperation. And I think the trick is to stop the fossil fuel party, especially the shale gas revolution, before it hurts even more people. And as a biologist, I only have a small role to play. I can speak to the data and bring it before you. I'm not a politician or even an activist, but I do believe that the right decisions can be made with good knowledge, and that knowledge is power. So that's what I hope that I share with you today, along with a very fearsome desire to see big change in our energy systems in my lifetime. And I think it's always happy for me to come to a place like Romania, because you have already seen in your own lifetimes huge changes that you probably, when you were very young, thought would be impossible, because forces that were so powerful seemed like they would last forever, but in fact things can change. And when I see my children communicate with their friends through electronic means that I don't even know how to use, right? Not only texting, but Snapchat and Instagram, and I see the huge change in telecommunications within my lifetime. Why can't we do that with our energy industry? Why can't we have the same rapid change as we do with electronics and computers? If we brought that ingenuity that we use for telecommunications to our energy system, we could do amazing things. And I think that's a doable project. So when I go home and visit my mother's house, the same house that my father built for her where I was adopted, my mother does not understand how to use my computer. And yet, when we look out her back kitchen window, we see the same coal burning plant that was there since before I was born. It's the same horizon. They're still shoveling coal into the same oven to turn on the lights, even though I can walk around now with the whole library in my pocket inside my cell phone in ways that my mother no longer understands how that can be. So we've made all this progress on telecommunications and zero in my lifetime on energy. And I'm determined as a biologist at this historical moment to change that fact. I feel that that is what we're all called to do. That is the big moral crisis of our time, is that we're killing the planet and killing our children in the way we produce energy. We know the solutions are there, but they're being held hostage by the oil and gas industry. And our job is to rescue the hostages. And I'm determined to win that fight.
O mică rugăminte, dacă doamna doctor ne comunică câteva din acele rezultate negative asupra animalelor, până când apare cartea dumneavoastră.
Yes, so this book is, the main author of this book is the animal scientist Michelle Bamberger, and the title of the book is The Real Cost of Fracking. The negative effects on animals that she was seeing is stillbirth among livestock, and death, and also fur falls off, so bare skin on the animals and open sores. In many cases, the people who also live on the farm have some of the same problems with their skin. So we see similar skin problems in both the animals and people. And then in addition, in the animals who die, they
de sfârșit un scurt comentariu. În momentul în care am aflat de vizita Sandrei în România, am fost foarte bucuros pentru că și eu sunt de formație om de știință, să spunem, sunt fizician și am înțeles tot timpul că dovezile științifice sunt acele dovezi care nu pot fi contestate dacă politicieni, guvernanți pot încălca legile, legea gravitației, legea vitezei și alte legi nu pot fi încălcate oricât de mult și-ar dori și atunci ele ne vor fi tot timpul aliați, vom avea aliați și știința va fi un aliat al nostru în această luptă pe care, într-adevăr, putem să o câștigăm. Iar ceea ce știința ne aduce astăzi și experiența americană, rămânând în sfera științei și a tehnologiei, vreau să vă spun că astăzi am călătorit în timp. România este la începutul acestei probleme a gazelor de șist și noi ne aflăm, practic, într-o călătorie în timp, văzând înainte să se întâmple care sunt pericolele acestei tehnici de fracturare hidraulică, vedem consecințele pentru oameni, pentru animale, poluarea apei, am discutat despre poluarea solului, poluarea aerului, efecte la copii, la femei însărcinate și așa mai departe. Iată-ne că avem astăzi posibilitatea pentru România. Nu știu cum vom putea noi să ajutăm America în această luptă, dar o vom ajuta. Iar pentru acest moment suntem bucuroși că am reușit să deschidem o primă dezbatere științifică, dezbatere cu probe științifice publicate în reviste prestigioase din Statele Unite și mai departe vom putea comunica aceste informații apărute pentru prima dată în România publicului larg și de ce nu să ajungă la urechile factorilor de decizie. Vă mulțumesc!